I found the box 3 days after my husband's funeral, buried under a pile of his old flannel shirts that my niece had already labeled for Goodwill. It was just a simple wooden keepsake box, scarred at the corners, the kind of thing Michael rubbed his thumb over when he was deep in thought. Inside, underneath his father's watch and a stack of faded lottery tickets, there was a leather journal with a single line on the last page that would eventually dismantle a $1 million fraud and sentence my own niece to 18 months of sorting vintage handbags under a lanyard that said original forger. That box was the beginning of everything. My name is Sarah, and I'm 52 years old. My husband Michael was a union electrician with hands that could wire a substation blindfolded but never quite figured out email. We were married for 31 years before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in the parking lot of a Home Depot where he'd stopped to buy a new socket set. He was 54. We never had children of our own, so when my sister's daughter Jessica came to us a little over a year ago, full of ambition and breathless about a vintage clothing boutique she wanted to open, we saw an echo of the family we'd never built. Michael liquidated his entire pension, $92,000 after taxes, and we handed it over with a signed operating agreement drawn up by our lawyer, granting me a clean 40% ownership stake in the business she called Chic Relics. I was the back office numbers person, the quiet accountant who balanced every ledger down to the penny, a skill I'd honed stretching Michael's overtime pay through lean winters when work was slow and the heating oil bill came due. I knew how to read a balance sheet and spot a rounding error that someone else would overlook, because for 3 decades, I'd done our household books on a yellow legal pad, tracking every expense in columns so tight Michael joked we could audit the IRS. And I had one other secret I almost never talked about. My father was a locksmith, and before he died, he taught me how to impression a key and rake a 3-pin cylinder in under 30 seconds. When I was 12, he'd sit me at the kitchen table with a vise and a filed-down blank, showing me how to wiggle the key up and down against the pins until tiny brass marks appeared. I still carried his old HPC picks in the bottom of my purse, a rolled leather case with a short hook, a half diamond, and a tension wrench, a superstitious talisman I'd never had a reason to use. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and sympathy cards, the kind of afternoon where you shake hands with people whose names you immediately forget, the air thick with lilies and the metallic hum of the rented folding chairs. Within 24 hours, the vultures circled. Jessica arrived with her husband Mark, a real estate agent who always wore a navy blazer with no tie and talked like he was closing a deal on a condo he couldn't afford. He had a way of standing too close, his cologne a little too sharp, and he'd pat your shoulder with 2 quick taps as if sealing an offer. They didn't cry. They managed. Jessica hugged me too hard, her arms stiff and rehearsed, and whispered that she'd stay as long as I needed. Then she immediately began sorting Michael's belongings, so you don't have to face it alone. She worked through his closet with the efficiency of a warehouse supervisor, tossing shirts into donation bags, piling shoes by the door. I watched from the hallway, listless and hollow, as she pulled the wooden box from the top shelf, flipped open the lid, and wrinkled her nose. She held up a tarnished pocket watch, a dried-out keychain from a defunct casino, a stack of old lottery tickets Michael had collected like comic books, each one a $2 fantasy he'd buy on Fridays after a long week. "Why did Uncle Michael keep this junk?" she said, her voice thin with impatience, and without waiting for an answer, she dropped the whole thing into a cardboard box marked Donate. The box landed with a soft thud that I felt in my chest. Then she patted my shoulder and left for the night, promising to be back at 9 sharp. I waited until their taillights vanished. Then I walked barefoot into the silence and retrieved the box. It smelled like the cedar sachets Michael used to tuck in his sock drawer, a warm, woody scent that made my throat tighten. The exterior was some kind of soft pine, sanded smooth but never stained, and when I ran my fingers along the bottom, I felt a slight ridge. I pried it up with my thumbnail and discovered a false bottom panel, a thin sheet of wood that lifted away to reveal a leather journal, its cover soft with age. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where I'd slept alone for the first time in 3 decades, and I turned to the last page. Michael's handwriting was cramped but steady, the blue ink of a ballpoint he'd probably borrowed from the nightstand. It read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Do not trust Jessica or Mark. They've been asking about the boutique structure, how the ownership works, what happens if you pass away. I think they are planning something. Call Jean Lassiter at the Riverside branch of Capital Mutual Bank. I've already set up a safety net. Save yourself. I love you. Remember the key. I read it 7 times, the way you might reread a diagnostic report you don't want to be true. My chest went cold, a numb spreading pressure like ice water through a vein. I tried to tell myself it was just Michael being paranoid, that the stress of the pension cash-out had made him suspicious, but he was never a paranoid man. He was the kind of guy who left the garage door open overnight and shrugged it off. If he wrote this, he meant it. I folded the journal into my pocket, the leather still cool, and sat on the cold bedroom floor with my back against the dresser until the sun came up, tracing the outline of my father's lockpick case in my purse, thinking about keys. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family should be a safety net, not a trap. The next morning, Jessica and Mark arrived with a manila folder and a care plan. They staged an intervention in my own living room, arranging chairs like a mini board meeting, the coffee table cleared of my Michael's crossword books, and replaced with a legal pad and a silver pen. Jessica clasped my hands and leaned in close, her eyes wide and wet with what looked like grief but didn't quite reach the muscles around her mouth. "Aunt Sarah, we're so worried about you. You're not sleeping, you're not eating. You shouldn't have to deal with the house, the bills, all the paperwork. Mark and I want to take care of everything. We'll move you into our guest suite. You just rest. We'll handle the estate." Mark slid a document across the coffee table, a durable power of attorney and a voluntary assignment of my 40% stake in chic relics to Jessica, retroactively characterizing my $92,000 as a personal loan rather than an equity investment. He used phrases like streamlining administration and reducing your stress burden, his fingers pointing to signature lines with a practiced ease. I watched his lips move and remembered Michael's warning, and a small, cold part of my brain began cataloging the exact logistics of this betrayal. I played foggy. I let my hands tremble a little more than necessary. I blinked slowly, and I said the grief had made everything blurry, that my short-term memory felt like a static radio, that I sometimes forgot where I'd put my coffee cup. I asked if I could just take a few days to think, maybe a week, just to get my bearings. They exchanged a glance, the kind of look that says the mark is weaker than expected, a flicker of triumph that Jessica quickly masked with a sympathetic nod. "Of course," she cooed. "We'll get the guest room ready. You just bring yourself. Don't worry about a thing." Within 72 hours, I was installed in their attic suite, a converted space with a sloped ceiling and a deadbolt on the outside of the door that Mark claimed was just an old lock he'd never gotten around to removing. A throwaway line delivered with a chuckle, but I noticed it immediately. I'd grown up around locks, and a deadbolt on the exterior of a bedroom door is never accidental. They gave me a twin bed with a floral quilt that smelled faintly of mothballs, and a dresser with 3 drawers that stuck when you pulled them. Jessica made a show of bringing me tea every evening, a chamomile blend she said would help me sleep, but I noticed she never stayed to drink her own. Her eyes would dart around the room as if taking inventory of my compliance. I was under house arrest disguised as hospice care, and I began documenting everything. The undercover investigation started almost immediately. I kept my door cracked at odd hours, an inch or two, enough to hear the frantic cadence of Mark's voice on the phone downstairs. He paced the kitchen tile in socks that whispered against the grout, saying things like, "No, the buyer needs a clean IP transfer, that's the holdup. And look, as soon as we get the widow's signature, the $750 clears, but until then we're floating." $750,000. That was the exact offer from a regional competitor called Elevate Vintage, a chain I'd heard Jessica mention with envy months before. Now they had a binding letter of intent, but the buyer's due diligence had uncovered my 40% ownership stake, and the sale couldn't close without a dissolution agreement signed by me. Mark's panic escalated. One afternoon, I heard him scream into the phone that a bridge lender was calling in a note, that they were 30 days past due on a balloon payment for their own mortgage. He was yelling about a personal guarantee, something that put their house on the line. I sat on the edge of my bed, heart pounding, and cataloged every word. The bridge lender's name was Alta Vista Capital. He repeated it 3 times in the span of a minute, each repetition more desperate than the last. The balloon was $95,000, due in 12 days. Jessica's voice in the background was shrill, a sound I recognized from her childhood tantrums, telling Mark to just get it done. Jessica's spending didn't match the panic. A brand new Porsche Cayenne appeared in the driveway, its window sticker still clinging to the back glass, the options list showing an MSRP north of $85,000. Delivery trucks arrived daily with boxes from high-end consignment platforms, clothes she'd never wear to the boutique she supposedly ran. I saw credit card statements left carelessly on the kitchen counter, balances swelling past $80,000 on a single Amex, the minimum payment circled in red. One morning, I found a pile of receipts from a luxury day spa, a $500 haircut, a weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast that cost more than our monthly mortgage. They were burning money they didn't have, convinced the sale was a foregone conclusion, and that my signature was merely procedural. They were wrong. A week into my stay, Mark's home office filing cabinet jammed. I heard him cursing, yanking at the drawer with enough force to wobble the whole unit, a sound of frustration that rattled the thin walls of the attic. Jessica called up the stairs. "Aunt Sarah, you said you used to fix things, right? Can you look at this stupid lock?" I came down slowly, still playing the frail widow in a cardigan, my steps careful and my shoulders hunched. The lock was a simple 4-pin wafer mechanism, the kind you'd find on a dorm room desk, with a bright chrome face and a keyhole that took a flat key. I knelt, examined the face, and said I might be able to jiggle it open with a paperclip. I went to my purse and retrieved my father's set, palming the short hook and the tension wrench. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying light clockwise pressure, then slid the hook in and began raking the pins back and forth in a tight, controlled motion, feeling each wafer click as the plug rotated. Within 10 seconds, the plug turned, and the drawer slid out with a smooth glide. Mark, too distracted by a vibrating phone, didn't notice the tools. He grabbed a stapler from the drawer and slammed it shut, then walked out of the room without a thank you. But in the 3 seconds I had, I saw a green hanging folder labeled Chic Relics Sale, tabbed with a fluorescent sticker, and my heart kicked against my ribs. That night, when they left for a late dinner with potential investors, I put on a pair of latex gloves I'd lifted from the kitchen junk drawer, thin and pale blue, and I went back into the office. I tensioned the plug again, raked the pins, and the lock surrendered as easily as before. I opened the filing cabinet like a surgeon, the rollers gliding on metal tracks. The green folder was stuffed with documents, and I spread them across Mark's desk, photographing each page with my phone, a slow, methodical process so that every corner, every staple, every handwritten note was captured. The first thing I found was a signed letter of intent from Elevate Vintage, outlining the purchase price of $750,000 for all assets of Chic Relics, contingent on clean title and transfer of all intellectual property. The second was a draft asset purchase agreement with a section left blank for the schedule of ownership percentages. The third was a document so sloppy with fraud that my accountant's heart nearly seized. It was titled Consent to Dissolution of Operating Agreement and Assignment of Membership Interest. It bore my name, Sarah E. Mercer, signed at the bottom in a handwriting that mimicked my own, but the loop on the capital S was wrong. I circle my S counterclockwise. This forgery traced it clockwise, the arc starting awkwardly from the top and curving in the wrong direction, a habit forgers pick up when they're working from a photocopy. The notary block was stamped with a commission that expired in 2019, issued to a woman named Patricia Kellerman. I paused and ran a quick obituary search on my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. Patricia Kellerman had died in January 2020, 18 months before the document's date. The notary seal was a photocopy of a seal from a long-dead notary, a felony in every state. The document was dated the day Michael died, when I was in the ICU waiting room, my hands stained with his coffee, not in front of a notary. I photographed every page, including the exhibit that listed the sale price to Elevate Vintage as $750,000, with a distribution schedule that paid Jessica and Mark 90% and categorized my contribution as a loan, repaid at par value, exactly $92,000. They'd even drafted a payoff letter from a fake bank account, ready to hand me a check for my loan repayment and send me on my way with a pat on the back. Under the forgery was another file, shredded but not bagged. They'd used a cheap crosscut shredder, the kind that produces uniform rectangles about the size of a postage stamp, which meant reconstruction was possible with patience and clear tape. I spent 4 hours on their kitchen island, arranging strips like a puzzle, the overhead light pooling on the granite. I worked from the edges inward, the way I used to do jigsaw puzzles with Michael on rainy Sundays, first finding the corners, then the straight-cut sides, then grouping by color and text alignment. I used a glue stick from their junk drawer to mount the strips onto blank printer paper, then reinforced the seams with clear tape on the back. The first document I reconstructed was a bridge loan agreement from Alta Vista Capital, using the boutique's inventory and accounts receivable as collateral. The loan was for $200,000, taken out 6 months prior, with a personal guarantee signed by Mark. The note was in default, and the lender was threatening to liquidate the collateral if payment wasn't received within 10 days. The second document was a credit card application in Jessica's name that listed the boutique's projected sale proceeds as the source of repayment, a level of reckless optimism that made my stomach turn. The third was an email printout between Mark and a real estate agent, discussing the sale of their own house to cover the bridge loan if the boutique deal fell through. They were drowning in a sea of their own making, and I was the life raft they intended to use. I sat in that kitchen until the first gray light seeped through the blinds. My back ached, my eyes burned, and I could feel a faint cramp in my wrist from the precision work, but I had a complete forensic file. I slid the reconstructed documents into a manila envelope, hid them in my room's air vent behind the slatted cover I'd loosened with a butter knife, and climbed into bed. When Jessica brought my tea that morning, I smiled weakly and thanked her, and she never saw the steel behind my eyes. The next morning, I called Jean Lassiter at the Riverside branch using the landline in my room so there'd be no cell records. I gave him Michael's name and the account number I'd found on a deposit slip tucked in the journal. Jean's voice was calm and practiced, the voice of a man who'd seen too many widows and too many disasters. I told him about the forgery, the notary, the bridge loan, the asset purchase agreement. He listened without interrupting, and then he said, "Mrs. Mercer, your husband came to see me about 11 months ago. He was concerned about your niece's business practices. He didn't trust that the operating agreement alone was enough, so he filed a UCC-1 financing statement on the assets of chic relics naming you as the secured party. That means you have a perfected security interest in every tangible asset of that boutique, from the cash register to the last vintage scarf." But he went further. He formed a new entity, a Delaware Series LLC, and he transferred the boutique's registered trademark, the name Chic Relics, the logo, the domain URLs, the social media handles, and all customer email lists into that entity. You are the sole member. There's a dormant provision that triggers upon any attempted sale without your notarized, in-person consent. The moment a purchase agreement is signed without your signature, ownership of the entire intellectual property portfolio automatically reverts to you, and the law firm we've retained holds a cease and desist letter ready to deliver to the buyer. It's a dead man's switch, essentially. The buyer cannot use the name, the branding, the online presence, or the customer base without your explicit license. Without the IP, the physical inventory and lease are worth pennies on the dollar to them. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the phone pressed hard against my ear, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't grief. It was the cold, clarifying flush of vindication. Michael, a man who couldn't set the DVR, had navigated the UCC and Delaware LLC law with enough precision to build a legal hammer. Jean explained that Jessica and Mark had likely never even run a proper title search, had assumed the operating agreement was the sole governing document, and had no idea the IP was separate. He gave me the exact filing numbers, the date of the UCC one, and the name of the registered agent for the LLC, just so I'd have it on hand. I asked if I needed to deliver the physical forged documents to someone. He said yes, but he could have a courier, a retired sheriff's deputy he trusted, meet me at a neutral location the next day. He suggested I come to the Capital Mutual branch in town under the guise of a routine trust meeting so Jessica and Mark wouldn't suspect. I agreed. I also gave Jean the name of the Alta Vista Capital contact I'd overheard, and he said he would contact their compliance department immediately. Within 24 hours, Elevate Vintage's lender would be notified that the sale was tainted by a forged signature and that the IP title was clouded, triggering an automatic freeze on any funds transfer. Meanwhile, Jean would request an emergency temporary restraining order from a judge he knew, a no-nonsense jurist who hated financial predators. I hung up and stared at the sloping ceiling, feeling Michael's hand on my shoulder for the first time since he died. But before I pulled the trigger, I needed to test the last remaining ember of family loyalty I held for Jessica. I needed to know if there was any humanity left in her, or if I could proceed without a flicker of guilt. So I staged a collapse. It was a Thursday afternoon. I waited until I heard Jessica's footsteps in the hallway, her familiar quick clip. Then I took the forged dissolution document from its hiding place in my dresser, clutched it to my chest, and walked unsteadily toward the top of the stairs. I let my knees buckle at the exact spot where the banister ended, a place with no handhold, so I'd fall convincingly. I gasped, a wet choking sound I'd practiced in the mirror, and crumpled sideways onto the landing carpet, still gripping the folder. My head lolled, my eyes fluttered, and I let my breathing go ragged, the way you see actors do in medical dramas right before the defibrillator. Jessica rounded the corner, saw me supine on the landing, and for a split second her face registered annoyance, not alarm. Her brow furrowed, the corners of her mouth tightened, and she looked at me like I was a stalled car on her morning commute. Then her eyes dropped to the folder. She stepped over my prone body, planted one heeled boot inches from my fingers, and bent to retrieve the papers. I felt the air displace as she moved, heard the rustle of her slacks, smelled her perfume, something floral and expensive. She flipped open the cover, verified the document was intact, and then glanced down at me. I was gasping, my lips going pale, my chest heaving. She looked for a long moment, and I saw absolutely nothing in her eyes. No fear, no hesitation, just a cold calculation. She said, "Mark, call an ambulance in a minute. I need to get this thing locked up first." She walked away. I heard her key turn in the filing cabinet lock. A full 90 seconds passed before she dialed 911. I lay there, breathing shallowly, and let the last thread snap. When the paramedics arrived, I insisted it was a panic attack, nothing more. They offered to take me to the ER, but I signed the refusal form and went back to my room, where I stared at the ceiling and planned the final act. That night, I transferred the envelope of evidence to my courier, a retired sheriff's deputy named Gene Sent, a quiet man with a gray mustache who met me at the end of the driveway and took the envelope without a word. I slept for the first time in weeks. 5 days later, the noose tightened from outside. Gene called to confirm the temporary restraining order had been granted ex parte, freezing all of Jessica and Mark's accounts tied to chic relics, and prohibiting any transfer of the business assets or intellectual property. Elevate Vintage's escrow officer had received a formal notice of litigation and was holding the $750,000 in a suspense account. The sale was dead in the water unless I signed the release. Jessica and Mark didn't know any of this yet, but they could feel the delay, the lawyer calls, the buyer's sudden reticence. On a Saturday morning, they cornered me at the kitchen table with a new set of documents and a notary they had hired, a woman named Clarice who worked out of a mailbox store in a strip mall and clearly didn't care about jurisdictional formalities. I recognized her from the Yellow Pages ad I'd looked up days earlier. "Aunt Sarah," Jessica said, smiling with too many teeth, "we're going to the bank to finalize some paperwork for your trust. It's just a formality, then you can rest. The bank's conference room is reserved. We'll even get you a coffee from the cafe next door." I played along. I put on my best cardigan, the one with the frayed cuffs, and I let Mark drive me to the Capital Mutual branch where I'd first spoken with Gene. The car ride was silent, except for the soft hum of the Porsche's engine and the occasional nervous tap of Mark's fingers on the steering wheel. I watched the town go by, the same streets I'd driven with Michael for decades, past the diner where we'd eaten breakfast every Saturday, past the park where he'd taught me to change a tire, and I felt a calm so deep it was almost physical. I knew Gene would be there, along with an investigator from the county's financial crimes unit and a process server with the TRO in hand. I walked into the conference room slowly, leaning on Mark's arm like a woman twice my age. Jessica was already seated next to Clarice, a notary stamp and journal laid out on the polished table. The room smelled like printer toner and stale coffee. They slid a consent and release form across the mahogany, pointing to the signature line with a silver pen. Mark handed me the pen. "Just sign here, Aunt Sarah," Jessica said, "and then we can all go home." I picked up the pen. I held it for a long moment, weighing it like it was made of lead, my thumb on the smooth metal barrel. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Then I set it down with a deliberate click. I looked at Jessica. "I'm not signing anything that makes you a felon, Jessica. You forged my signature once. You're not going to watch me do it for real." Her face went through a microcosm of colors, confusion, shock, then a pale, furious white. "What are you talking about?" she hissed. "Stop being dramatic. This is for your own good." At that moment, the conference room door opened. Jean Lassiter walked in, a tall man in a gray suit, followed by 2 detectives in plainclothes and a uniformed officer from the sheriff's department. One detective held up a badge and said, "Jessica Vance, Mark Vance, you're being detained on suspicion of forgery, fraud, attempted grand larceny, and conspiracy. This conference table is now a crime scene." Clarice the notary stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and hit the wall with a sharp crack. The detectives produced the temporary restraining order, the forged dissolution document in a clear evidence sleeve, and a warrant to seize their phones and financial records. Mark lunged for the door, his face purple, but the uniformed officer stepped into his path and bent him over the table with a practiced movement, cuffs clicking onto his wrists. Jessica began to cry, a high keening sound that bounced off the acoustic ceiling tiles, ugly and raw. She looked at me, tears cutting tracks through her foundation, mascara bleeding into the lines around her mouth, and said, "Aunt Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this. We were just going to take care of you. Please don't do this." I watched her without speaking. The detectives read her Miranda rights while she sobbed, and she was walked out of the bank in handcuffs past a line of tellers frozen with their hands on their keyboards. Mark was already in the back of a cruiser, his blazer rumpled and his face a mask of fury. I sat in that conference room for a long time after they left, the pen still on the table, and Jean brought me a cup of coffee from the cafe next door, just as Jessica had promised. It was lukewarm and bitter, but it tasted like justice. What happened next took months, but justice is a slow, satisfying grind. The district attorney's office filed multiple felony counts, and the evidence I'd provided was described by the lead prosecutor as a gold-plated gift. My photographs, the reconstructed shredded documents, the notary fraud, and the recorded timeline of Michael's death all painted an airtight picture. Jessica, facing decades in prison, agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted grand larceny in exchange for testifying against Mark, who had orchestrated the bridge loan fraud and the notary scheme. Mark was convicted at trial, the jury deliberating for only 3 hours. He received a sentence of 6 years in state prison, and as part of his conviction, his real estate license was permanently revoked. The bridge lender, Alta Vista Capital, filed a civil suit against him for the deficiency, and his house was eventually foreclosed, the Porsche repossessed in the middle of the night. Jessica received a suspended sentence of 5 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and an order of restitution. But the civil case was where Michael's countermeasure truly paid out. Because the trademark and IP had automatically reverted to my entity, Chic Relics as a brand was mine, free and clear. Elevate Vintage, still interested in the physical inventory and the retail lease, renegotiated the deal with me as the sole owner. I sold them the boutique's tangible assets, the racks and the mannequins and the carefully curated collection of vintage Chanel bags, for $460,000. I kept the domain, the social media accounts, the email list of 15,000 subscribers, and the brand name, which I rebranded immediately to Second-Hand Vows. Second-Hand Vows became my second act. I built an online resale platform that focused on vintage bridal and formal wear, leveraging the existing customer base and the scandal's publicity. I hired 2 part-time fulfillment specialists, women in their 50s like me who had been downsized out of corporate jobs, and we leased a clean warehouse unit on the east side of town with good lighting and a loading dock. I launched a marketing campaign that leaned into the story without ever naming names, using phrases like "built from a broken promise," now delivering second chances. The first quarter, we sold 1,200 gowns. By the second year, we had partnerships with 3 bridal consignment chains and a feature in a national wedding magazine. The business now generates more profit in a quarter than Chic Relics ever made in a year, and I own 100% of it. But the most satisfying part came at the restitution hearing. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had clearly seen every shade of family betrayal, reviewed the civil settlement and the terms of Jessica's probation. She looked over her reading glasses and asked if I had a preference for the form of Jessica's community service restitution. I'd thought about this moment for a long time, lying awake in my new little apartment above the warehouse, and I had an answer ready. I said, "Your Honor, I request that the defendant be required to perform her community service hours as an inventory sorter at my warehouse, Second-Hand Vows, and while she's working, I'd like her to wear a specific lanyard." The judge raised an eyebrow. "What does the lanyard say?" I answered, "Original forger." There was a pause, the kind that swallows a courtroom whole, and then the judge's mouth twitched. She looked at Jessica, who was standing with her public defender, her face draining of color. The judge said, "Creative restitution is within the court's discretion. MS. Vance, you are ordered to complete 18 months of inventory sorting at Second-Hand Vows, 40 hours per week, wearing a lanyard with that exact text. Failure to comply will result in revocation of probation and imposition of the suspended sentence, which I remind you is up to 5 years in state prison." Jessica has been working for me for 11 months now. She arrives at 8, clocks in on a tablet that logs her hours for her probation officer, and stands at a sorting station in the back corner, grading pre-owned gowns for resale value. She steams wrinkles, checks beadwork, and sorts by decade and designer. The lanyard is bright yellow, with bold black lettering, and she has to wear it in visible location at all times during her shift. Customers occasionally visit the warehouse for sample sales, and when they see her, they sometimes snap photographs. I don't stop them. A few weeks ago, I walked past her station and saw her folding a silk tulle skirt with a kind of mechanical detachment, the lanyard swinging as she moved. She looked up, and our eyes met for the first time in months. There was no defiance left, no calculation, just a hollow resignation. I remembered her stepping over my body to save a forged piece of paper, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity. Just the quiet certainty that Michael's warning had saved me. Michael's brilliance was never in the grand gesture. It was in the small, invisible safety nets he wove when no one was looking. He couldn't wire a business deal the way he could wire a 3-phase panel, but he understood that the people who claim to love you can also be the ones who empty your bank account while you're still grieving. He left me the key, literally and figuratively, the lockpicks my father gave me that he never made fun of, the journal he hid in a box of junk so the vultures would overlook it. And now, I spend my days surrounded by dresses that once belonged to strangers, each one with a story of a promise made and sometimes broken, each one getting a second chance at a new beginning. I suppose I got mine too. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you want more stories about family justice and quiet revenge, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. This is Sarah, signing off from Second-Hand Vows, where every thread gets a new beginning.